Hello, I have recently finished reading Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, another book that I read in class with a bunch of kids. The kids didn't appreciate it nearly as much as I did. Um, yeah, it's a pretty interesting book. I have to say, uh, it's not as good as I was thinking it would be, and the reasons for that are retroactively like pretty obvious. I mean, Frederick Douglass is very like heavily like his book is heavily oriented around a sort of like propaganda aim that he has, which is convincing people that slavery is as evil as he can possibly get them to believe, and and that's something that I agree with, and that's something that everyone that I have ever met, with maybe a few exceptions, that are keeping it really well. That's something that almost everyone in the modern world agrees with. And so Frederick Douglass is his book is like rhetorically trying to convince us of something that we all already believe. And so it's, I guess, not as just like it's still a great book, but it makes it really clear to me why it is that we have modern fictionalized slave narratives. As I was reading this, I was sort of just idly thinking in my head, like, these books are so good, and what is even the point of like modern retellings of this circumstance? Modern stories about slavery times, when we have like nonfiction books that are incredible. Like, why do we need to write new stories if we have the old ones that people can just go and read? And I think the answer that I came to as I was thinking about this while we read Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass is that the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass does not really speak to modern circumstances in the way that, say, Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad does. Both are fantastic, but Colson Whitehead is speaking to a 21st century audience. He knows that everyone who reads his book agrees with him that slavery is horrible, whereas Frederick Douglass doesn't think that everyone is going to agree with that. In fact, he's very, very conscious of the fact that some of the people who read his memoirs are going to be straight up slave owners. There's parts of the narrative where he says, like the escape part, the real the real money shot of the whole biography, where he talks about how he actually got away. He says he basically skips over everything. He cuts out all the details of what happened. And the reason he does that, he says, is that he doesn't want to give away secrets. He doesn't want to give away techniques that could lead to other people escaping from slavery. And that makes a lot of sense. But it's a stylistic choice that, um, I don't know, makes it less interesting to a modern audience. So yeah, I mean, I think part of the interest of this book, I mean, first of all, even for like regular people who aren't like old book brained the way that I am, I think it's just interesting to have a first-hand account of what this time period was like for someone who lived through it. And second of all, for the more I don't know, old texts, for people who like me have old book autism. Uh, uh, the book is fascinating because it sort of helps you to like reconstruct the mentality of these people that Frederick Douglass is talking to, these sort of zeitgeist of the moment that he was so good at speaking to, which is ambivalent about these questions that are totally settled for us. So yeah, I mean, I think it's both interesting for the direct, like firsthand account of what's going on, and also because it speaks to this context that's totally dead. I mean, it really like breathes life into history. It helps you sort of understand uh, the the context of the time just by the rhetorical techniques, the rhetoric that he uses, and the where he chooses to argue and where he chooses to not argue. One thing I found really interesting was there's a postscript in the version that I read where Frederick Douglass talks about religion, his religious beliefs. And it's funny because what he wants to explain is that he wants to say, look, I'm a Christian. Like, despite what I say in the book, I'm a Christian. And And let's just not get it twisted. I'm a big believer in Christ. I love God so much, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason this is really funny to a modern reader is that it's super, like, the text is dripping with religious illusion. Even to people who aren't like biblically literate, it's super duper clear that this guy thinks about God all the time. He has, like, religion is sort of like a nexus for his worldview. But apparently, for readers at the time, that's not enough to say that you're religious, because once or twice he's like, what kind of God would even let this sort of thing happen? Which I guess to modern readers doesn't sound like flirting with atheism, but I guess if you're reading this book in the 1840s, that's tantamount to saying there is no God. Um, yeah, let's see. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else interesting to pull out of this. Um, I guess Frederick Douglass wrote more biographies that I haven't read later in his life, so it'd be interesting to put this one in dialogue with those, see how the way that he presents himself changed over the years. After the Civil War, there was no longer a risk of giving up like secrets of the slaves. Um, he also has a critique of the Underground Railroad, which I found pretty interesting. It's interesting because I don't normally think of abolitionists as having any, as being like having disagreements with each other. Um, I guess I don't really think of black abolitionists as having disagreements with each other, but this is a circumstance where Frederick Douglass is making a critique of radical abolitionists who are willing to go very far in their beliefs, and it's just interesting to see those things aired publicly. His critique, by the way, is that by publicizing the things that people were doing in the Underground Railroad, by talking about them so openly, they are sure getting some people out of slavery through their actions in the Underground Railroad, but um, they're also increasing the paranoia of the slaveholding class, which will have negative effects on the well-being of the slaves who do not escape. Which I think is a really fascinating critique, because you can really see how like his heart belongs to the slaves, because I think you could equally make an argument that the fear and paranoia of the slaveholding class is a good thing overall for reducing the longevity of this institution. Like it's good that they're afraid. But he's also like totally right that paranoia is mainly going to be vented on people who continue to be enslaved. So yeah, it's an interesting little bit of you know, a historical debate that is rendered completely irrelevant by the coming of the Civil War. Um, Trying to think of if there's anything else from this book. There's a lot in there that is like flickers of things that you could really go into. Um, but of course, I didn't have time with a bunch of high schoolers who wanna just get the stuff done as quickly as possible. Um, I also think it's really interesting to put in dialogue with the era. Like it's quite interesting on its own, even if you don't know anything about American slavery. But if you know just a little bit about the historical like circumstances, he really breathes life into them, and also like makes you kind of think about things that you didn't think about before. There's this dynamic in the book around the improving of his conditions as a slave, where on the one hand he wants his conditions to improve, but on the other hand, it is exactly like once he's a little bit more comfortable, once he is a little bit more able to reflect, once he's not exhausted all the time because he has to be like in the fields 24/7. He's able to reflect on his situation, and it makes him less contented rather than more. Um, which is actually a really interesting thread in the book, because early on he has this, I almost said racist character, this racist, guy who existed in his life, comes along, and Frederick Douglass is learning how to read. This nice lady who owns him is, I guess, nice by slaveholder standards, is teaching him how to read. And her husband comes along and he says, "Well, you can't teach him how to read." Like he gets really mad and basically says, "If Frederick Douglass learns how to read, he's just going to want to run away. The once he learns how to read, the desire to escape will be permanent. He will just never stop wanting to escape until he succeeds or dies." And, this is a horrible, racist guy. But Frederick Douglass, in this weird way, actually affirms exactly what he's saying. Like at several points in the book, he goes out of his way to make comparisons to what this guy said, and to basically point out that, like, yeah, this guy is like a horrible racist, but his analysis of the situation is completely accurate. That as soon as Frederick Douglass knows how to read, it lights a fire in him. It increases his desire for freedom in a way that makes it so that, he's eventually going to die, or he's going to get free. Um, the other thing I wanted to say is it's quite interesting just knowing about this guy, because um, like I was saying earlier, the text is in dialogue with the era in a way where, like, the text is interesting in itself, but understanding what about this text made it so interesting to people at the time helps you understand more about the time period that it came from. Well, the same dynamic applies to Frederick Douglass himself. Like, Frederick Douglass is a really interesting person, but he was extremely famous at the time. And sort of working backwards and reverse engineering, like, what about this guy made him so incredibly famous? And I think there's probably more to be said about this, more interesting thoughts to be had about this than the ones I happened to have while reading the book. But what jumps out at me is that he is an embodied counter argument to a lot of the dumb shit that slaveholders would say, and defenders of slavery. I mean, a lot of these people believed that African Americans could not govern themselves. They were too stupid. They couldn't be educated. They couldn't, understand the Bible, whatever. They couldn't understand the principles of government well enough to govern themselves. And, you got to imagine, like, you're one of those guys. Like, you kind of believe that, but you don't have a whole lot of conviction. And then one day this guy comes to your town, and it's before the invention of television. So you're like, okay, whatever, I'll go listen to him speak. And you see him, and it's this formerly enslaved black guy who is speaking very eloquently, and you don't understand everything that he's saying. Like, the stuff that he is saying makes a lot of sense. It's very moving, but he's also speaking at a level that is just above where you're at. This guy is clearly smarter than you. And you've got to believe that really unsettled people who had beliefs about the inferiority of black people. Like, this guy is a walking proof that's all a bunch of bullshit. Um, so yeah, I think that's really interesting. And like I said, I might be reading some biographies in the future about Frederick Douglass. He himself wrote some more, so it'd be interesting to compare those. There's also David Blight, a Civil War and Reconstruction historian, wrote a really long biography that I think is interesting. I tried to read it a while back and failed, partially because I think David Blight assumes that you have read all three. He's very humble in this way. He writes a biography about Frederick Douglass, and he sort of just assumes that you have already read all of Frederick Douglass's own autobiographies, which I hadn't. And then he uses historical records to compare what Frederick Douglass said about himself to parts of his life that we know about, but that he didn't really emphasize. Um, yeah, so that's pretty interesting. And I also think that so I think I might be returning to this topic. I very likely will. I've also been reading a biography of John Brown, and it is really fascinating to compare the two figures, because we do know that John Brown and Frederick Douglass knew each other. In fact, John Brown tried to bring Frederick Douglass in on some of the schemes that he had for liberating slaves. And Frederick Douglass, although he didn't think John Brown was joking or anything, he didn't think he was messing around. He wasn't really interested in getting involved in, like, a direct, violent way. And it's also fascinating. I guess I'm just straying into talking about John Brown now, but it's also fascinating the different forms of abolitionism that they had. I mean, Frederick Douglass even talked about this. He compared his feelings for the slaves to those of John Brown, and he basically said that the thirst for liberation was stronger in John Brown than it was in him. He said, Frederick Douglass, I can live for the slave, he can die for him. Which is an incredible thing to say. So they're interesting to put side by side like that. And I don't know. I'll come back to this when I finish the John Brown biography. We will be talking about this again, but I'm very interested in this topic of like what is really the radical move here, you know? When you're trying to unseat a corrupt institution, when you're trying to help a group of people, what's better to live for them or to die for them? And I think with Frederick Douglass and John Brown, you have two different approaches to the same problem. Yeah, man, you could really sink your teeth into that one. It's like a dissertation. I mean, somebody's probably already written that dissertation. Um, anyway, yeah, that's all I got for now. I will be back at some point to talk about John Brown and maybe Frederick Douglass again. Okay, yeah, that's it. Bye bye.